WTF happened in 1971. This is when Nixon officially declared the entire world that we will no longer be backing up our US dollar with physical gold. This announcement requires a brief history lesson and some context. For a long period of time, US dollar was backed by gold. For almost 100 years, US dollar was about $18 per ounce of gold. But that changed after World War I. War is expensive, so to fund the war, governments around the world had to print more money, at which point the nations unofficially came off the gold standard. During World War II, Nazis were after physical gold as well, so they can keep funding the war. That caused a flood of physical gold from Europe into the US to protect it from confiscation from Nazis. So when the war ended in 1945, US invited the leaders of the developed nations to the historic Bretton Woods Conference. This is where US told the entire world that their currency will be the reserve currency, and all commodities will trade in US dollars. In return, US promised that it will maintain the US dollar backed in by physical gold. The US did that because it had all the gold that fled Europe during World War II, but now essentially US confiscated it and imposed its term on the entire world. In the late 1960s, the rest of the world started questioning the backing of the US dollar with gold. So when countries asked the US to trade their US dollars for the gold as promised in the Bretton Woods Agreement, President Nixon pulled off a historic move on August 1971 and told the entire world that the US is temporarily removing the convertibility of the US dollar to gold. This is when the US officially came off the gold standard. Since then, inflation has been out of control. Real wages have been declining, and houses and commodities have outpaced the wage growth by a large multiple. I'd like to share some really interesting stats from the website called WTF Happened in 1971.com. Chart number 1. This chart is self-explanatory. Up until 1971, productivity and compensation kept pace with each other. But after 1971, real compensation went down and accounted for inflation. However, productivity maintained its incline. After 1971, inflation went up exponentially, but the wages didn't keep up with inflation. This only widened the gap between rich and the middle class. Chart number 2. Up until 1971, single income was sufficient for a household, but that changed after 1971, and the number of households requiring 2 income earners went up year after year. That has a negative impact on family values. Parents don't spend enough time with their kids, and less traditional values are taught to kids. The rate of divorce has also gone up since 1971. And that probably has to do with both parents earning income and not having enough time for their relationship and the kids. Money that's not backed by hard physical constraints is bound to fail and will bring society to its knees in the long run. Chart number 3. This is self-explanatory. The average price of a home was only 2.5 times the annual wage back in 1971. Keep in mind, that's a single income earner's wage. Compare that to today in the US and Canada. In Canada, the average home price is about $750,000. An average household income is $160,000. Keep in mind, that's a dual income household. This shows that real wages have declined and inflation has climbed exponentially. Also, take a note of prices of other essential items like food, gasoline, and university tuition before 1971. Chart number 4. Electricity, food, and fruit CPI chart. The rise in price of daily necessities has been exponential since 1971. Monetizing food and energy has a negative impact on society. Humans have been constantly improving technology, which in turn should increase productivity, and that should have a deflationary effect on prices. But instead, we see the opposite. Chart number 5. U.S. National Debt Chart. U.S. national debt is already insolvent. There is no way possible to repay the debt. U.S. GDP is not enough to repay the debt, and this is a global issue. The only option is to keep printing more money, only to pay back interest, which means that debt will keep increasing at an exponential rate. This chart is a representation of just that. Debt is increasing at an exponential rate since 1971. Chart number 6. Energy consumption versus real GDP. This is a very interesting chart. The amount of energy required to produce same or more goods has actually reduced since 1971, which means that we have been advancing in technology at a faster pace than ever. The outcome of that improving technology is always deflationary. However, that's only true if money is not printed out of thin air. The money printing or inflation has nullified the positive price deflationary effects of improving technology. Chart number 7. Trends of obesity in children. Bad money also negatively impacts our food. The quality of food has gone down dramatically since we came off the gold standard. We have now more obesity among young children, and this chart shows how dramatically the number of obese children have increased since 1971. Conclusion. Money with no physical constraints will always get corrupted. It is naive to think that humans can be trusted with such immense power. Fiat money has no physical barriers. It can be printed out of thin air, and the ones who have access to freshly printed money have more purchasing power, because inflation has a lagging effect, which is always felt by the individuals who receive that printed money later. Also, an individual living paycheck to paycheck can never save enough to invest that money to protect themselves against inflation. This crushes the middle class and destroys poor people.